Hey ocean travelers around the world. This is the Bermuda Triangle. Vanishings no radar can explain. In one of Earth's busiest sea and sky crossroads, ships and planes have disappeared where radar and radio should have saved them. Tonight the record is sifted to learn what really vanishes and why. It begins on a cool December afternoon off Florida's Atlantic edge. 5 Navy training bombers Grumman TBM Avengers lift from Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale. The date is late in the war's final year. The time is set by routine, a standard navigation hop called Flight 9. The crew list shows 14 men spread across 5 aircraft, with an instructor leading and 4 students following. The plan is simple: fly east from the Florida coast to practice bombing on a sandy shoal, turn north for timed legs, then swing back west to home. Weather reports call for winds freshening from the west and scattered showers over warm water. Daylight favors them. Fuel margins look comfortable for a training loop of a few hours. On paper, no drama. The first leg goes cleanly. Bombing practice is completed over the hens and chickens shoals in the Bahamas, a spot pilots learn to recognize by the light patchwork of shallow sandbars under green water. The turn north should be the easy part. Track a compass heading, keep formation, cross-check time. But over the sea where every direction can look the same, small errors grow. A few minutes either side of the planned wind correction and a group can drift. Voices reach the radio net from the lead aircraft. The instructor sounds strained but controlled. The men think the compasses are acting up. Bearings feel wrong. One voice suggests they might be over the Florida Keys. Another insists they had gone east enough that the Keys would be behind them. The more they talk, the less certain they sound. A controller, on land, logs the exchanges. The words aren't wild, not mystical, they're practical and worried. The men cannot agree on the fix. The instructor reportedly says the compass is out and that he is trying to fly by landmarks. But the sky has turned hazy, and the sea below offers only dark and light patches. All the same, all moving. Fuel ticks away. Avenger bombers are sturdy machines with radial engines and broad wings, but they are also heavy and thirsty. Margins shrink when time stretches. They change course to find a coastline. The problem is which coastline they are chasing. Radar along Florida's coast is improving by this stage of history. But it is not a blanket. Ground-based sets reach only so far over the horizon because radar, like light, is a line-of-sight tool. The Earth curves, signals skim, and then sail out into space. Farther targets drop into a low-altitude shadow. If an aircraft drops below a certain height or flies beyond certain ranges, the returns fade into sea clutter, a messy echo field created by waves and spray. Controllers do their best to plot positions, but the coverage is patchy, and Flight 19 flies at a time when identification beacons and constant transponder pings don't exist. What the shore knows comes in bursts of voice and incomplete bearings, recorded by human hands on pencil charts. Wind over warm ocean can build lines of showers fast. Convective cells bloom, then collapse, then pop up again miles away. Reports talk of deteriorating visibility and scattered rain. The cold season in that latitude still carries the Gulf Stream's warm ribbon and unstable air. Night is coming. Fuel windows close like clock hands. An experienced instructor may keep a calm voice, but each minute without a fix is a minute closer to forced decisions. Formation discipline helps until it doesn't. If fuel gets tight, each pilot has to maximize his own chance to stay in the sky long enough to see land or find a break. That's how a group can separate without drama, simply by trying different headings or different altitudes. Over wide water, a split by a few degrees for a few minutes means miles. And once a wingman loses sight of a leader in haze, reacquisition is not guaranteed. Search procedures start even as the last transmissions trickle in. Radios carry fragments, heading adjustments, doubtful landmarks, estimates of drift. No one declares a clear mayday. That isn't rare. Aviators often fight the aircraft to the end, and the final minute arrives too fast. Or antennas ice, or static drowns the plea. Controllers spin up a rescue. A Martin PBM Mariner flying boat, large and robust, launches to sweep the suspected area. Witnesses on a tanker report a flash later that night. Some accounts say a fire or explosion on the water. At the time and place a rescue plane would be transiting. Search aircraft comb the seas. Coast Guard cutters and Navy vessels run patterns through the night and into morning. Then many mornings after, the ocean gives back nothing. It is not just 5 Avengers missing. It is the rescue plane too. Newspaper columns start drawing lines between the dots. An ordinary training hop becomes the case people remember first when someone says Bermuda Triangle. Quick fact: the phrase Bermuda Triangle is younger than the incidents it describes. The disappearances came first. The label came later. But people love a name, because a name feels like a map. And a map feels like control. Watch out for this. When a story begins with no trace, the mind reaches for magic. The rest of this night's journey tries something else. It keeps the magic on pause and listens to what instruments, clouds, currents, and human decisions can explain. Flight 19 deserves a patient look. The course plan versus the actual path matters. The planned east leg to the shoals happened. After that, a turn north, under a sky, without land cues, invites drift. If the winds were stronger from the west than forecast, or if the pilots undercorrected, the group could end up more east than they believed. Confident navigation can be undone by a subtle bias. If the lead believes the group is over the Keys, he might fly northeast to reach Florida's coast, not realizing they are already east of the Bahamas. That choice would take them farther out. If visibility drops and the sea stacks into gray bands, there are few resets. Fuel windows are cruel teachers. At certain burn rates, the Avengers might have had only so many options: climb and extend radio line of sight, but sacrifice endurance, or stay lower to conserve, accepting worse radio reach. Choices like this complicate later radar reconstruction. Early post-war shore radar wasn't decisive, because coverage did not stitch a continuous picture at low-level range. The returns that might have been Flight 19 are ambiguous or lost in noise. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really enjoy and want to fall asleep with ocean stories whenever you want. Through the long night, rescue ships work expanding square patterns, the classic shape of serious search. A rescue commander picks a datum, a best guess center, based on last transmissions and probable drift, then draws boxes to cover the sea with overlapping eyes. The PBM Mariner, that vanished, was itself a great machine, with long range and the nickname Flying Gas Tank. Its fuel system and size meant power and endurance, but also risk. Fumes could ignite if a spark struck wrong. Tanker crew testimony about a flash supports the grim possibility that the Mariner suffered an onboard event unrelated to any mystery in the water below. Meanwhile, radio logs and the first newspaper reactions create the early public archive: a lost flight, a lost rescue plane, and no survivor to explain course decisions or instrument readings. The stage is set for decades of retellings. Step away from airplanes and look at a steel giant. The calendar slides back to the final winter of the First World War. A colossus, named USS Cyclops, departs with a load most people never think about: manganese ore, a heavy mineral used for steel making. She is a massive collier, a coal and cargo carrier with a long, deep hull, a single giant engine, and a crew list in the hundreds. The route seems straightforward enough. Leave Brazil, stop in Barbados, then steer northwest toward the mid-Atlantic states. The last confirmed position near Barbados places her on the edge of the Great Belt, later called the Triangle by magazine writers. From that moment, silence. No distress call received, no confirmed sighting after departure. Families wait on piers that face out to a horizon that never answers. The cargo matters. Heavy oars shift when poorly trimmed. A rolling sea can press loads against bulkheads, designed for something else. Stability changes if free surfaces slosh in part-filled holds. Coal dust and ore dust complicate ventilation. Cyclops carries a single great engine and a backbone that must flex and hold. Witnesses before departure talk about the vessel riding low. Navy logs later list the captain's decisions, the route, and who boarded or left at last ports. Then the trail ends. Weather corridors across that stretch of ocean can turn from manageable swell to heavy seas if a front sweeps down. Radios of the era are primitive by modern standards. If the ship takes a quick catastrophic list, or if a structural failure unfolds in minutes, there may be no time to clear a signal. The paper trail that survives is a mix of telegrams, bureaucratic updates, rumors, and investigations. People send notes about supposed sightings. None verify under close examination. The Navy concludes with cautious language: loss unknown, presumed due to some combination of structural stress, cargo shift, or storm. What it cannot do is draw a neat box around a wreck site. The Atlantic in that belt is deep and relief-rich, a quilt of seamounts and trenches. A ship of that size could go down in a place that swallows evidence, especially when lifting, sonar, and deep search are decades in the future. No coherent radar plot exists, because in 1918, there is no radar in service at sea. The technology arrives later. The absence of a signal is not proof of the supernatural. It's a sign of early 20th century limits meeting bad luck. Now the tape jumps forward to a merchant ship with a name that sounds like a warning label. The SS Marine Sulphur Queen sails in the early 1960s with a cargo of molten sulfur, carried hot in converted tanks. The configuration is unusual. Instead of liquid fuel, the hull's innards hold heated chemical cargo near melting point, prized by industry but hard on structure. Inside the ship, heat cycles soak steel, bolts, and welding seams. Stress points concentrate where tank boundaries meet older frames. Crews know the smell and the feel of this service. It is unforgiving when maintenance falls behind. On her last voyage, the ship makes a routine departure and sends routine messages. The weather isn't terrifying on paper, but the ocean doesn't need to be angry to be dangerous. A long swell, an awkward quartering sea, and a ship that vibrates in certain harmonics can reach a tipping state. The last call goes out. Later, only debris is found, life preservers, odds and ends, no intact hull or unified wreck to tow. The absence of a complete debris field bends imaginations. Yet sulfur cargoes, when spilled into seawater, can create messy burn patterns and aggressive chemical reactions. A hull failure under stress could go fast enough that the ship breaks and sinks almost as one, leaving only scattered flotsam. No coherent radar plot shows up in summaries, not because radar watched and lost her, but because shore-based sets couldn't see a freighter across distant horizons, and the ship did not carry transponders that would be routine decades later. If the breakup happened far from any radar horizon under modest weather, the no-plot line simply marks the limits of coverage, not a magical blank. Close to shore, the mind expects safety. That's why the small case of the motor yacht, Witchcraft, feels sharp. The boat is near Miami, the skyline close enough to paint reflections in the black water. The owner reportedly calls to say the boat has hit something, or that a problem has developed. The Coast Guard logs the call and prepares to assist. The distance from help measures in minutes, not hours. Then the line goes quiet. The yacht carries lights. The city's own glow rides the low clouds. In calm weather near a coast, the search pattern seems like a formality. Yet boats of that size can capsize quickly if a sudden weight shift meets a sharp wake, or a swell rebounds from a seawall. Down flooding, the fast flooding of internal spaces through open hatches or cockpit doors, can pull a hull under in seconds. If a vessel goes inverted, air trapped in the cabin and buoyant foam under decks can hold it just long enough to drift into the strong river of the Gulf Stream, the great northbound freeway of warm water that runs just steps off South Florida. In a short time, a boat that sank near mile zero can slide miles offshore beneath the surface, shedding only small items that blend with nighttime chop. Search perimeters grow using math of drift leeway for a boat, set and drift for surface winds and currents, divergence for uncertainty. The box expands quickly. In daylight, a white speck catches the eye. At night, even a lit cabin can hide in the glare of city sky. Silence. Again. Aviation returns to the story with the British airliners Star Tiger and Star Ariel, both part of a fleet that crossed the Atlantic in the era before jets shrank oceans to a few hours. These were sleek but propeller-driven aircraft, running long legs over water using a mix of celestial fixes, radio ranges, and dead reckoning. Fuel margins on winter roads could be tight because pilots selected altitudes to catch favorable winds or escape headwinds, and detours around Weather 8 reserves. Radio procedures were formal, position reports at intervals, relays through island stations, and long stretches of static. The region between Bermuda and the Azores, or Bermuda and the Caribbean, held gaps where mid-ocean radar coverage was essentially absent. Radar, again, is a coastal and airborne tool. Without airborne radar pointed at them or ground sets close enough to bend around the Earth, aircraft were dots in the imagination of controllers, not on glass screens. On the days of those flights, reports mention weather puzzles, fronts, perhaps a line of showers, or a layer of cloud. Winds not ideal. Pilots choose altitudes above or below a cold inversion to avoid icing, but the choice might put them in less favorable winds. A small instrument error, a misread, or a turbulence-induced loss of a couple hundred feet can go unnoticed in darkness. Engines of that generation are hard-working but demand attention. A subtle fuel imbalance, a carburetor issue, or a misset mixture can nibble at range. When the last routine transmission is the last anything heard, people searching later are left with what investigators always have: the clock, the distance still to fly, the fuel carried, and the wind. If the clock runs out before landfall, the end likely comes in a black sea under cloud, quick and clean, leaving no time to mark a position. At this point, patterns can be assembled without forcing them. What do the famous disappearances share? When the lore is stripped down to logs, many involve weather that was not outright monstrous, but fickle: squalls, showers, sharp gradients of wind, or confused seas. Navigation uncertainty shows up again and again in eras before GPS made a blue dot follow a finger. Load and maintenance questions hover at the edges of several cases, from ore and sulfur to aging airframes flying long sectors with non-trivial maintenance histories. Communication gaps are constant: radio ranges that cut out, antennas that fail, or procedures that were followed until the final minutes when the crew focused on handling the machine. And there are elements that belong only to storytelling: triangles drawn with crisp corners that were never official, rumors of eerie compass spins without maintenance logs to back them, or dramatic last messages that shrink under scrutiny. Verified logs are quieter than legends, but more instructive. The map itself is not magic. There is no official border labeled Bermuda Triangle on any chart from the Navy or the Coast Guard. Writers draw varying definitions. Some corners at Florida, Bermuda, Puerto Rico. Others stretch the shape toward the Azores or down to near Hispaniola. The boundaries float because the name grew from articles, not from navigational directives. Under that patch of ocean lies bathymetry that matters. The seafloor drops fast off the continental shelf into trenches and deep plains. The Puerto Rico Trench is the deepest spot in the Atlantic, a gash where wreckage can fall beyond easy reach. Ridges fold and basins settle. Currents accelerate where the Gulf Stream squeezes through. Depth matters because recovery odds shrink with every added meter. A ship that sinks on a shallow bank leaves a clear mark. One that drops into deep, cold water leaves only a silence. The surface won't break. Air and sea traffic volume through this corridor is immense. More traffic means more incidents simply by exposure, but it also means many more rescues and many more routine flights and passages that make it through boringly fine. The risk in a busy corridor looks big in raw count but small when normalized by the number of transits. Data requires that kind of humility. The very same density that gives the place its myth also gives it its safety record. There are always other vessels, other controllers, other radars nearby.
especially today. So while the past looks like a line of orphans, the present is a live network stitched by technology that did not exist when the myths were born.
Radar deserves its own slow, clear look. Shore-based radar rides masts and towers. It is limited by horizon and by the wavy skin of the sea below, which returns echoes that mask small targets. Airborne radar on search aircraft can look down with some clever tricks to reduce sea clutter, but in the mid-century era that capability is limited. Ship radar is powerful at short range, great for avoiding collisions and seeing squalls, but no ship in the 1940s was sweeping the entire alleged triangle and logging everything. A no return on any given night means very little until it is tied to line-of-sight geometry. Consider ducting, a propagation quirk where temperature inversions trap radio waves and bend them unusually far. It can make distant patches look close or hide targets that would normally be visible. Consider that radar needs surfaces that reflect well. A small wooden or fiberglass hull can be almost invisible at range compared to a steel freighter. And remember that early airborne and ground systems required trained operators reading analog scopes, interpreting faint smudges with tired eyes. It is tempting to think of radar as an all-seeing machine. In these stories, it is just another tool with limits. Modern systems change the picture. ADS-B for aircraft broadcasts. Identity and position once per second, allowing networks and satellites to watch over oceans. AOS for ships does something similar, layering live traffic on digital charts. Satellites catch ELE and EOBird beacons through the COSPA's SARSAT system, turning a crash or a capsize into an instant alert with approximate coordinates. But even now, some things slip through. Beacons corrode, antennas snap, a battery dies, a signal triggers under a storm cell that blocks satellite view for an orbit, and the next pass arrives a few minutes too late. There are still blind spots and bad moments, just fewer and smaller. That contrast helps explain why old cases feel different. When modern tools find most things quickly, the few that remain open feel larger than their number. The weather engine, in this belt of water, deserves respect. Over warm ocean, squall lines build quickly. Microbursts, intense downdrafts that crash out of a cloud base, can slam an aircraft on approach or punch the surface into sharp pyramids of spray. Waterspouts spin up, visible in daylight, as ghostly ropes. At night, they might only be a texture on the wave field, until a boat runs into the wrong patch of air. The Gulf Stream is a moving runway of warm, fast water. When a colder wind blows across it, the contrast creates low clouds, choppy seas, and wind shear. A captain steering near the edge can feel a sudden shove across the deck, as the bow meets a different river than the stern. For a small vessel, that shove can swing the beam toward breaking water. Night flying or boating under rapidly changing cells invites decision pressure. Climb or descend, steer left or right, slow down or keep speed to clear the weather. Every choice trims or spends margin. Sea surface hazards include one that sounds like folklore, but isn't. Rogue waves. They are not mythical monsters but statistical outliers, created when swell trains stack in phase, or when current meets wind, at just the wrong angles. In the North Atlantic, the Gulf Stream's fast northbound flow occasionally collides with a strong wind from the north or northeast, steepening waves like a carpenter's hand, lifting a plank under a rug. The result can be a short, steep wall that catches a small vessel broadside. A yacht's bow can ride over a normal swell and then bury under a sudden steep crest. Down flooding happens in an instant. Large ships can also feel rogue waves, but their scale makes them less vulnerable to a single crest, unless the wave geometry matches the hull's length and resonance. Debris from such events can be pulverized by the very motions that destroyed the vessel. Fiberglass shards sink invisibly, cushions and wood scatter beyond recognition. Magnetism lives near the core of the triangle's folklore. The myths say compasses spin wildly or point toward forbidden places. The facts are quieter. Earth's magnetic field varies. Is Zygonic lines, mark how many degrees a compass diverges from true north at each location. The agonic line, where magnetic and true align, has wandered across the Atlantic for centuries. Navigators account for variation by adding or subtracting a published number. In some eras, the agonic line sat near the Bahamas. In others, it shifted. A crew not up to date on local variation would see a compass reading that feels odd. Instruments also fail sometimes. A stuck card, a bubble, a poor installation near a stray magnetic source on the panel, or a lightning strike can dirty a reading. More often, humans misread good instruments while under stress. A glance misinterprets the bezel setting, a student holds a drift correction too long, or a leader trusts a visual landmark that is a cloud shadow on water. These are human stories, not planetary tricks. Human factors carry a quiet weight through every case. Fatigue eats attention. Task saturation crowds out the simple question that might save a flight. What if the wind is stronger than forecast? Confirmation bias leads a leader to favor the first diagnosis, that they are over the keys, even when later signs disagree. Over-reliance on dead reckoning in the dark, under a sky without stars, leaves crews married to an earlier guess after the ocean has changed the math. Get there-itis, the pilot's slang for pressing on to a destination despite doubts, shows up in investigation after investigation. Storm avoidance decisions, the choice to go around or through, are easier to analyze later than in the cockpit. Crew coordination, the way a captain and first officer or a skipper and mate challenge each other's assumptions, turns average crews into resilient ones. When that coordination fails, an incident becomes an accident. Communications and the mystery of silence need translation for a modern audience. Radio ranges in the mid-1900s were limited. HF radios could cross oceans, but they were moody static from lightning hundreds of miles away could drown weak signals. VHF radios were clearer, but much shorter in range. Tied to line of sight, antenna failures hide in small things. A corroded connector, a fractured masthead whip, a grounding strap that took a hit from salt spray and never got replaced. Lightning can inject noise or kill a set without leaving a mark. Anyone sees later, procedures of the era expected routine position reports at certain fixes. If a system failure or an urgent cockpit problem arrived between those reports, the last good position is not the final one, and a mayday might never be sent because the crew prioritized flying or stayed busy troubleshooting. No mayday is common in non-mysterious losses. Emergencies often compress time so ruthlessly that radio time disappears. Why do some wrecks leave so little? Physics answers with a list that sounds almost poetic. Foundering is the slow surrender of a hull to water that finds its way in. Once buoyancy is lost beyond a tipping point, the vessel can go under with surprising speed. Down flooding is the dramatic version, when openings admit a flood in seconds. Negative buoyancy, when the combined weight of the hull and its cargo exceeds the water displaced, means a ship has no reason to float once its air pockets vent. Implosion at depth is the submarine's separate nightmare, where pressure crushes a hull inward, but surface ships avoid that because they stop long before the depth that crushes steel. Floatables versus sinkables matter. Foam, wood, and sealed plastics ride currents and reach beaches. Heavy equipment, engine blocks, anchors, and most cargo go down and stay down. Debris fields disperse with time. A life ring that could tell a story if found in a day looks like any other ring, if found in a month and separated from its vessel by 100 miles of drift. There is a playbook for search and rescue. In these waters, the Coast Guard, Navy, and regional partners run it with discipline. Planners take a last known position, estimate drift of an object with certain windage, and draw probable tracks. They use leeway tables for different craft. A life raft blows faster than a low floating log. A capsized hull with a keel up behaves differently in a crosswind than a person in a life jacket. Patterns include expanding squares, sector searches that sweep slices of a circle,
and parallel track patterns when the probable area is large. ELTs in aircraft and EPRBs on boats. When they trigger, shout to space and set a starting box. But sometimes beacons never trigger. If submerged too quickly, if not armed, if batteries failed unseen. Sometimes signals are never heard because of antenna angles and terrain, or persistent storms overhead. Even the best pattern can miss a small target and meter-high chop at night. The next move is to pull back even farther and run a data check. How often do incidents happen in this region compared to similarly busy corridors? When incident rates are normalized by traffic, the triangle does not spike above peers. It sits in the pattern one would expect for a high-use route with active weather. The selection bias that gives the place its mystery operates like this. Dozens of accidents across decades are linked after the fact by a polygon drawn later. Then media amplify the montage and reinforce the shape's power. Human brains love clusters. Even random dots look like constellations when lines are drawn. Risk perception is distorted by storytelling pressure. The very cases that stick in memory are the ones with gaps in the record, the noisier story, the simpler anchor. Meanwhile, routine saves and recoveries, also in the same polygon, pass without retelling. Media shaped the myth with magazine pieces and paperbacks that rose and fell with the tides of popular culture. Early, key publications took a handful of incidents, stitched them together with suggestive questions, and wrote, "No trace," in big letters. The narrative formula is durable. A montage of cases, a focus on the unknown, a horizon shot to set the mood. In that formula, some mundane truths fade, that a cargo might have been overweight and badly trimmed, that a pilot might have misread a compass with a cracked face, that weather can evolve faster than a routine position report can catch. Sensational coverage isn't a conspiracy, it's a market. People like mysteries. A mystery called the Bermuda is better packaging than a busy storm-prone corridor with a long history. Skeptics arrive with meticulous audits. Patient researchers open the archives, compare newspaper stories to original Navy reports, and correct dates of last sightings. Weather archives are checked. Sometimes an incident retold as calm and clear turns out to have happened under gale warnings. Case by case, the picture simplifies. Not every correction solves everything. Small, stubborn gaps remain. Lacking a final position is not failure. It's the normal state of affairs when a vessel disappears without modern beacons and satellites. Skeptics do not erase wonder. They turn it into respect for complexity. The wild ideas deserve clear-eyed evaluation, not mockery. Methane hydrates, for example, are real frozen gas, locked in seabed sediments, that can fizz out under certain conditions. If a large bubble field reached the surface, it could lower water density and rob a ship of buoyancy, in theory. The question is whether such releases in the triangle are large, frequent, and sudden enough to account for catalogued losses. The evidence so far does not show event clusters that match the timing or distribution of famous disappearances. Magnetic anomalies exist, local crustal quirks measured by surveyors, but repeatable, sustained anomalies that spin compasses like movie props are not documented where the legends place them. Space-time claims sound cinematic. What evidence would be required? Clock drifts, synchronized recorder anomalies, independent instruments agreeing on a lapse. The record offers no such tight, multi-instrument case file. A fair test asks for data. The ocean answers with its usual, some data, some silent. There is value in building modern reconstructions of old cases. Take Flight 19 again. A reconstructed wind field for that day, pieced from ship logs and island stations, suggests a net push from the west and some veering with altitude. An instructor who believes he is in the Keys might steer north-northeast to find Florida's long coast. But if he is east of the Bahamas, that heading carries him out into open ocean. A bounding box built with fuel endurance, climb profiles, and likely decisions can be drawn. Often it exceeds the historic search areas used on Night 1. That doesn't mean rescuers failed. It means they did not have access to the later weather reanalysis tools and satellite-derived current maps. Modern drifting models could push search perimeters farther east than tradition suggests. A similar lab approach applied to Cyclops includes stress analysis of her rides with heavy ore, calculating bending moments in long swell, and testing plausible failure modes of the era's steel. These reconstructions do not give certainty. They raise or lower the probabilities that different explanations fit the day's facts. What radar cannot explain is a small set of residual unknowns that remain after instruments, weather, and human factors are addressed. These include cases where core data is missing entirely. No load sheet, no maintenance log, no certified last fix. Some involve nighttime events with only a routine call minutes before silence. Others involve single small boats where even a handheld GPS, if aboard, left no record. A few disappearances remain anomalous under the best modern reconstruction, not because the sea bent time, but because the minimum facts are too few to close the loop. Respect for those families and crews means saying open instead of inventing a flourish. Practical takeaways for sailors and pilots today. Flow from this patient look. Good planning buys margin. Redundancy in navigation. Paper charts. Handheld GPS. A second compass. Covers rare failures. Decision points marked in advance. Keep a crew from drifting into the trap of just 5 more minutes past safety lines. Storm etiquette at sea includes slowing early, moving weight low, closing openings before the first spray hits, and steering for the best angle on the swell. Communication habits, short, frequent position updates, especially when weather worsens, help rescuers build a trail that doesn't end on a single dot. Risk in a corridor like this is not zero, and it should not be romanticized. It is a set of small dangers managed by simple habits. Contemporary near misses and testimonies add texture without proof of the supernatural. A ferry captain reports a night of disorientation when the horizon line vanished and rain erased the bow. The likely cause is rain fade and backscattered light from deck lamps, which blinds the eye to subtle surface cues. A private pilot describes a compass that stuck and then snapped back. Later checks reveal a misaligned compensator and a small steel souvenir mounted too close to the panel. A sport fisher crew tells of a sudden steep wave off the stream's edge. The later analysis shows a strong northbound current under a northerly wind, the classic steepening Essex. These anecdotes matter because they teach. They have limits because they are snapshots from long careers. The Sargasso Sea drifts through the edges of the story like a patient cat. This broad gyre, famous for mats of floating weed, has light winds and lazy swells. To eyes used to busy, textured water, it looks empty and slow. That is the trick. Weed mats cling to hulls and rudders. They mislead a sailor about motion when every horizon looks the same. For searchers, weed complicates spotting. An orange float blends with gold-brown weed patches under a sun that glints off everything. Drifting in the Sargasso teaches calm if a crew plans for it. It punishes those who mistake calm for safety. The legal and insurance angles are less romantic, but serve as the scaffolding behind the scenes. Underwriters classify unexplained with care because payouts and future rates depend on language. Flags of registry matter for which board investigates, which standards apply, and where records live. Accident boards set thresholds for reopening cold cases. New evidence must exist, not simply new interest. When a case remains open, it is usually because the physical evidence is inaccessible, not because the board embraced a mystic gap. Culture takes the triangle and turns it into books, films, and tourism. The feedback loop goes like this. A cluster of stories sells well. Travel brochures echo the name. The name draws more stories. That does not make the incidents fake. It makes the packaging strong. Travelers stand at waterfronts and point at the open sea that heads for Bermuda, imagining lines only they can see. The geography of legend overlays the real chart with a ghost chart that is easy to remember. Return to Flight 19 with an updated lens once more before moving on. Recent reconstructions work through more complete weather patterns and fuel calculations than early newspaper maps did. Some point to a more easterly probable loss area than the first night's search, which centered too close to the coast because of human hope and the natural bias to believe lost pilots are closer than they feel. The rescue PBM's loss sits now in a separate bin, likely unrelated except by time and map. The training flight's fate becomes less a conjuring and more a human chain, a misread region, a worsening sky, and the ocean's indifferent clock. Return to Cyclops, and listen to the weight of silence. A long hull, heavy cargoes, and a deep route under seasonal weather made that voyage a stress test she may not have passed. The absence of a signal persists because, after a structural failure, time compresses. The captain's last choice would have been to save lives in the moment at hand. If the sea rolled her quickly, or a fracture opened at a critical frame, the priority would not be radioing a location. It would be fighting the list and launching boats that later met a rough sea. Silence is not a riddle, it is a consequence. The verdict table at the end of this long walk would be honest, not theatrical. Some cases sit in the explain bin. Clear weather data, clear maintenance findings, or strong reconstruction of decisions. Fill them in. Others are likely explained, where the balance of probabilities favors human factor plus weather, or cargo plus structure. But no smoking gun was recovered. A smaller group is open, held there by missing core data, or deep water that will not yield a hull. In maritime and aviation investigation terms, unexplained is not code for uncanny. It means the available evidence cannot yet support one cause with high confidence. Night falls again over warm water. The epilogue is quiet. Instruments glow softly in a cockpit. A ship's bridge hums with low machinery. Outside, the world is featureless. A curve of sea and sky, with no edges. Navigation by instruments in such a void feels like trust in a friend. Steady, unemotional, faithful when the eyes and the ear lie. This is the emotional center of the story. Uncertainty belongs to every traveler at sea or in the air. It does not need to be dressed as supernatural to be felt. The conclusion folds gently. The triangle is a mirror. It reflects the tools a culture has at hand, the limits those tools carry, and the stories people tell when limits are reached. Curiosity and respect for the sea live side by side. One asks questions with patience. The other ties down hatches before the first cloud builds. A master timeline would run from 1918 to now, placing markers at Cyclops at Flight 19, at the merchant ships and airliners, at smaller boats with names remembered by local newspapers and families. The density would grow in the post-war decades because traffic grew and because reporting improved. The line would show not a spike of doom, but the steady hum of a busy corridor catching up with modernity. The most recent decades would compress the blank spaces. Satellites and beacons fill gaps that once invited ghosts. Attributions are simple and soft. This story leans on logs, weather archives, search and rescue manuals, and the patient work of investigators and historians. The sign-off returns listeners to calm. Like a lighthouse shining over a black water field, the sea remains what it always is, beautiful, wide, and perfectly indifferent, and that is enough to respect. In the long ledger of ocean travel, a simple way to picture the story is to run the dates in order and let the backdrop change as tools improve. It starts with colliers and liners crossing wide water with paper charts and radio sparks, then moves to propeller airliners with sextants in the cockpit, then to jets and GPS and satellites. The sea never changes its basic mood: patient, strong, quietly dangerous. But the way humans meet it changes a lot. When that timeline is laid out end to end, the so-called triangle looks less like a stage for a single theme and more like a busy corridor, where different eras leave different kinds of gaps. The early decades show the weight of steel and coal, big hulls, single screw propulsion, and cargoes that love to shift. Crews write tight, polite entries in logbooks. and the radio operator taps messages that island stations catch when the static clears. Search efforts depend on ships already at sea, altering course and on local knowledge of wind and current. If a ship disappears beyond the shelf into deep basins, the chance of a hull ever being found is small. The paper archive grows with telegrams and receipts, fuel taken on, cargo loaded, port clearance noted, and then stops cold. For later readers, the silence feels spooky. For the people of the time, it is sadly ordinary. Most losses everywhere, not just in that polygon, end in silence, because the shock is fast and the tools are few. Air travel writes the next chapter with aircraft that feel like sleek trains running through invisible tracks of wind. The pilots carry tables, compasses, and a kind of muscle memory for correcting drift. Over the ocean, position reports go out at points the crew plans along a line. A missed point can be anything from a radio hiccup to a reroute around weather. Land-based radar barely sees beyond the coastline. Mid-ocean, nobody is painting the aircraft. That's why the headlines for Star Tiger and Star Ariel cut so deep, routine, then nothing. They happen at a time when the public is still getting used to the idea that the sky can be a highway. No contrails linger for investigators. Only weather charts, logs, and estimates. When people talk about those two airliners, it helps to slow down and imagine the cockpit. The navigator maps out a track that threads favorable winds, knowing that climbing for smoother air might cost range. The radio operator works scheduled contacts with island stations, listening through static that waxes and wanes with distant lightning. The captain manages a night sky, where moonlight fades in and out under cloud and where a long, smooth descent can lead into a layer with hidden bumps. VHF's contact with anyone is short range. HF's contact rides the ionosphere and plays by its own rules. If the aircraft meets icing in a cloud layer and has to adjust power and mixture to hold speed, the small changes ripple through fuel math. If the crew diverts around a line of showers, the new leg lengthens. They can be doing everything right and still end up with a narrower margin than hoped. On many nights, that story ends with a safe arrival and nobody remembers the tight math. On a few nights, the math ends a few minutes short. The middle of the 20th century becomes a season of mixed signals. Better coastal radar and better SAR aircraft, but still gaps over the big blue. Rescue planes fly patterns, taught by manuals refined after a lot of hard lessons. Expanding squares begin at a best guess datum and grow outward until the fuel runs low for the searchers too. Back on land, radios improve, antennas grow taller, and maintenance culture gets stricter. Those changes reduce the pool of true mysteries, which has an odd side effect. When everything else gets solved faster, the handful of stubborn cases left uncracked start to look extra strange. Then the satellite age arrives and redraws how the world listens. A small aircraft broadcasts its position every second through ADS-B. A ship does the same on AIS. Emergency beacons ping a network in space that routes alerts to control rooms in minutes. A modern vanishing inside this corridor is more likely to be a miscommunication than a true blank. If a vessel really goes off the map now, it is because something physical, sudden and severe wiped out both the machine and the beacon path, or because human decisions turned the beacon off, or because the antenna never stood a chance in the specific way the boat overturned. The difference between eras is that today the search starts with a real box on a real chart, instead of a proverb and a guess. Zoom back down from the tech curve and take the human view again. In those waters, weather plays the steady antagonist. Small squall lines spin up along temperature contrasts. Microbursts throw down cold air that spreads fast when it hits the surface, turning easy chop into quick, choppy teeth. On a moonless night, the line where sea ends and sky begins can vanish. That messes with instinct. So instruments become the single source of reality. A pilot or skipper must trust. Rain is a shapeshifter in the beam of deck lights. Bright spray looks like surf, and a low, angry cloud looks like a cliff. In a small wheelhouse, Condensation creeps in while the mind argues with what the eye swears it sees. This is why crews practice instrument habits to muscle memory and why checklists codify obvious steps. Secure the cabin, latch the hatch, put the heavy stuff low, call the position now rather than later. Quick fact helps frame the radar angle in plain talk. Radar is not a magical eye. It's a flashlight in radio wavelengths. It can't bend around the planet unless atmospheric quirks help it. And when the beam skims the sea, waves toss back a glitter that hides small targets. Early sets painted that glitter on phosphor screens that faded slowly, so readings were a mix of now and a few seconds ago. Operators learned to look past the snow and trust repeating returns. In the 1940s and 1950s, that art had limits. A tight storm cell could look like a mountain. A low-flying aircraft far offshore could be beneath the radar horizon entirely. So a lack of radar return in an incident report is not evidence of a vessel slipping into another dimension. It is simply a reminder that radar coverage doesn't exist where the beam never went. Watch out for this. Applies to maps with dramatic borders. The triangle's lines were drawn by writers, not by hydrographers. One author's version reaches to Puerto Rico, another squeezes down toward the Bahamas, another pushes out toward the Azores. If the border can be moved to include anything compelling, then of course a reader will find more cases inside. A better approach is to fix the question, what is the incident rate per million miles traveled or per thousand flights? When measured that way, the corridor looks busy but not bizarre. The eye loves triangles. The ocean doesn't care. Some viewers want concrete case studies with nuts and bolts because that's how the brain quiets down. The Marine Sulphur Queen provides that. She began life as a standard T2 tanker, then was modified to carry molten sulfur hot, heavy, corrosive. The conversion added large longitudinal tanks, divided by bulkheads and heating coils, which changed how loads moved and how stress traveled through the hull. Engineers later worried about how heat cycles fatigue steel and how local stiffeners near tank boundaries carry extra load. In a quartering sea, a hull can twist just enough to concentrate stress at seams no one looks at often. If a plate gives at speed in the wrong place, the break can be fast, ugly and below the waterline. A crew on deck would have minutes, not hours. Afterward, debris would be odd. Some charred, some chemical scarred, scattered by both wind and the stream. The lack of a big coherent debris mass fits a sudden breakup in open water, not a long slow foundering near land. The witchcraft, by contrast, is the nearshore riddle that pokes people's sense of what close to help should mean. Near Miami, help is quick and lights are many. Yet a small boat in a small swell that meets the wrong wake at the wrong angle can expose big windows and doors to green water. Downflooding is not dramatic on the surface, it's gravity, with a stopwatch. A few hundred gallons in the wrong space makes a small yacht nose heavy or top heavy, and the next wave finishes the job. If that happens on the stream's edge, the current drags everything north at walking speed, or better. The boat can slip under in minutes. Soft items show up days later in a different county. The call for help logged at the start gives a tiny box. The stream turns it into a long ribbon. Searchers have to pick patterns that stretch like a scarf in the wind. Star Tiger and Star Ariel are helpful for unpacking the idea of no radar coverage. Imagine the mid-Atlantic in the night. Radar dishes spin at airports and some coastal stations, but there are no solid-state, low-power, long-life components yet for putting little transponders in every airframe. Bridges of ships have compact sets for avoiding collisions. Towers ashore help guide approaches. But nobody is scanning the middle. Over that water, tracking lives on flight plans and honest position reports. Crews use cosmic clocks, stars, and the sun. And when cloud covers those, they ride their own sense of time and speed. If the final leg happens under a blanket of cloud on a dark night in wind that's worse than forecast, the margin shrinks in a way that leaves little paper behind. The last position report, maybe an hour old, anchors the search, but a lot can happen in an hour's worth of wind. Magnetism deserves plain English demystifying because it is the myth's favorite prop. Earth's field lines aren't mysterious. They're mapped with boring, beautiful precision. Compasses don't spin for fun. They align with a field that has known kinks. The agonic line, where a magnetic compass points at true north, slides across maps slowly over decades. At times it has passed through the Bahamas. At other times it's sat elsewhere. So a crew expecting a certain local variation may be surprised if they're flying in a year when the published number changed and they didn't update. Add in the metal and wiring in a cockpit, which can create tiny local fields if a compass isn't compensated well, and a needle can be off by a degree or two. Over distance, a couple of degrees become miles. That's enough to turn a plan into a puzzle without calling in monsters. Human factors piece all of this together in a way that feels familiar, even to people who have never flown a plane. Fatigue trims attention. A leader, confident and experienced, may not hear a young voice suggesting a different heading, not because ego is loud, but because engine noise is louder and workload is heavy. Confirmation bias is sneaky. Once a crew believes they are over a certain landmark, every vague clue gets bent to match that story. Multi-crew coordination exists to fight that, to formalize how people challenge each other gently. When coordination slips, small errors survive longer. Training fights this by drilling the habit of asking boring questions under pressure. Does this wind actually fit the drift we're seeing? Does this fuel state actually match our plan? Those questions, answered carefully, prevent more incidents than any headline will ever capture. Communications failures are also less dramatic than legend suggests. Antennas fail at their weakest link, the connector. Salt air creeps into threads and crimps. A whip that flexes in years of wind hides metal fatigue in its base. Lightning doesn't have to be a direct hit to make trouble. Nearby strikes flood radios with noise or induce currents that fry delicate parts. An aircraft or boat can be fine with people alive and working hard and still be in radio blackout. Add in procedures that expect reports at specific points and an emergency that erupts between those points, and you get a final position that isn't actually final. It's just the last time someone had a spare second to talk. For viewers who enjoy reconstruction, a lab approach brings peace of mind. Start with knowns. Last radio call, departure time. Fuel aboard, expected winds from archived charts, sea state from buoys and ship's logs, and the known performance curves of the machine involved. Then sketch plausible decision trees. If an instructor thought he was over the Keys, here are the headings he would have chosen. If instead he thought he was east of the Bahamas, here are the others. Each branch creates a different search box. Apply fuel math to cut branches that last too long. Overlay the Gulf Stream's flow field for that date to see where debris would drift and how long it would take to reach certain shores. The boxes that remain are bigger than the boxes searchers had on day one. That isn't a knock on searchers, it's respect for the fact that today's tools weren't available back then. A modern team can say, the most likely area sits farther east by X miles. Not because of a hunch, but because currents and winds leave fingerprints. Rogue waves, often waved away as folklore by the old textbooks, are now measured, photographed, and modeled. They tend to show up where opposing flows steepen swell, and the stream is a natural laboratory for that. A boat that is fine in 8-foot swell at a long period can be in real trouble if a focused 20-foot wall appears at a much shorter period. Small craft are most vulnerable when their length matches an awkward fraction of the wavelength, making the bow dive and the stern lift at the same time. The physics here is simple energy stacking. There's no need to invoke a special region of ocean. But because the stream runs close to a highly populated coast, the memories gather here and so the stories gather too. The Sargasso Sea chapter is almost gentle. These floating gardens of Sargassum look lovely in photos and feel like a soft obstacle at low speed. For navigation they are tricksters. Weed wraps a prop and cuts thrust. A rudder loses bite. The sea around seems dead calm. So the mind underestimates drift. especially with a small breeze kissing the tops of mats. The sky looks the same in every direction. That combination, reduced control plus identical horizons, makes people believe they are holding position when they are not. Search aircraft looking down see flecks of orange and brown everywhere. The target blends. A life jacket that would pop against dark blue turns into camouflage. The lesson is practical. Mark positions often. Cut weeds early and avoid stopping in large mats under low wind if the boat doesn't carry a clean way to clear the prop. Insurance and legal files feel dry compared to storm tales, but they help explain why unexplained appears in official language. Underwriters do not pay out on mystery for the fun of it. They define terms carefully. Unexplained can mean no physical evidence recovered to support a more specific cause. It is a placeholder, not a verdict on the supernatural. Flags of registry matter because they decide which country's investigation body leads, and that decides what gets published and where. Some boards reopen cases when new physical evidence turns up. A hull found by chance, a diary washed ashore with dates. Interest alone doesn't do it. That threshold protects resources, so investigators can focus on cases with new leads. Culture takes all these threads and weaves a loop. Articles make a splash. A paperback frames a corridor with dramatic angles. Documentaries repeat the highlights and ask slow, suggestive questions. Tourism boards add the name to brochures. People come to see the lines that exist only in their heads and on souvenir t-shirts. It's not cynical to say this. Stories arrange the world for humans. They are tools for memory. The job here is to enjoy the story while knowing which parts are staging and which are records. Back to Flight 19. Slower and more granular, because the mind keeps returning to it. The lead instructor's experience is real. He had time and type and knowledge of the area, but experience has a trap. It builds preferences, and under stress, preferences feel like facts. The log of transmissions suggests a tug of war between competing mental maps. Keys versus Bahamas. With winds veering and strengthening, the dead reckoning solution slides under the pilot's feet, like a moving walkway going the other direction. One student suggests a heading west. The instructor worries that heading will take them deeper out. The group stays together long enough to burn fuel at a formation pace. Then conditions get worse. If one aircraft dips a little for better visibility and loses sight of the others in haze, the formation dissolves. Each pilot squeezes his own endurance to try to find land. Night complicates ditching. Even a smooth sea looks black and shallow until it is. It is easy to picture orderly ditchings followed by quick sinkings and a night where the stream carries rafts and seats away faster than search can converge. This vision is not macabre. It is sobering. It replaces magic with plausible human minute. The PBM rescue aircraft's loss sits awkwardly near that story because of timing, not cause. The tanker's report of a night flare, or flash compatible with an airborne explosion, fits known risks of that model's fuel system. Flying boats carried a lot of fuel. Fuel systems in that era had fewer layers of fail-safe design. Fumes and sparks didn't need a triangle to meet. That rescue mission's heartbreak is painful on its own and doesn't need to borrow mystery from the other loss. Two tragedies can share a date and a rough patch of ocean and still be separate. Cyclops remains the heavyweight that holds its silence without budging. Theories multiply in the void. Enemy action, sabotage, mutiny, catastrophic structural failure. But the best ones orbit the hull and its load. The ship stretched long and rode low. The cargo weighed like a warehouse, if a front running down from the north stacked seas against her length. And if the ship reached a resonance that flexed her backbone beyond design for a few cycles too many, a failure could start where no one was looking. Add in the possibility of coal bunker issues, ventilation problems, or a compromised hatch, and the loss can happen neither slowly enough to call, nor close enough to shallow water to leave easy evidence. Wartime censorship and chaos would explain why rumors outstripped facts. Later historians would do their careful work to separate the two. At the end, lost with all hands, cause unknown is not romantic. It is an honest boundary.
Data normalization keeps the conversation anchored. Take incident counts across decades and divide by traffic volume. Then compare this corridor to others with strong winds and heavy use, like the approaches to the English Channel or the Northwest Pacific near Japan. The rates join a family of numbers that look like each other. Outliers in this corridor exist, as they do elsewhere, but the shape of the curve does not scream special doom. Selection bias does the rest of the work to create a myth, highlighting only the stubborn cases inside a shape someone later drew, then ignoring the solved cases and the near misses and the rescues, paints a mood that data does not support. Near-miss vignettes settle nerves because they show cause and effect. A cargo pilot logs a night where static from a distant line of storms turned the HF into a RAVS. The crew reverted to timing legs and found themselves a few miles off their expected landfall. Corrected. Landed. Done. A Coast Guard helicopter crew remembers a microburst off the stream that hammered them in hover. The pilot added power, adjusted attitude, recovered, and later pointed to the weather report that verified the event. A yacht charter captain tells of a compass reading that made no sense until he remembered a steel knife magnetized the bracket nearby. He moved it. The needle settled. End of story. Each anecdote has a likely cause that fits physics and human systems. They are not proof against all mystery, they are proof that mystery is the least common explanation for most shocks at sea. From these threads, practical takeaways are low drama and high value. Mark positions often, even when everything is fine. Cross-check instruments against each other. GPS with compass, depth sounder with charted bathymetry, airspeed and power with expected fuel burn. Treat the stream like a moving road. Never assume a boat sits still while engines idle. Close and latch early. The ocean loves open doors. Read the sky in layers, not just the big clouds, but the low scud in the tails of anvils, because those tell where the wind is going to change. Build decision points into the plan where a crew commits to turning back or diverting, and honor them when tired brains want to cheat. Keep comms short, clear, and frequent when the weather starts playing games. The residual unknowns, the small shelf that remains after logic takes most of the books, are a mix of missing pages. Some cases never had a certified last fix. Some lacked maintenance records that would show whether corrosion or fatigue played a part. Some happened in storms where nearby ships recorded bad weather, but did not see the incident itself. A few sit in a gray zone where 2 or 3 factors could each explain the loss, and no physical evidence exists to label one primary. These are called open, not to stoke fear, but because honesty is the only respectful choice when talking about lives and families. It helps to return once more to mapping bathymetry, drawn in simple words. Off the floor to shelf, the depth drops from swimming pool numbers to canyon numbers fast. Small changes in depth matter for sonar, and for currents that hug the bottom. The Puerto Rico Trench is deep enough that equipment for a casual survey cannot reach. Only major expeditions with specialized machines can scan those slopes. Even when a wreck is found at depth, the current can be strong and the slope is treacherous. Lifting anything is a serious operation. That's why it took the world so long to find many famous wrecks outside this region too. Deep ocean hides well. Nothing in that is unique to a triangle, but the proximity to busy coasts makes the contrast feel sharp. Just over there are beach, neon, and highways. Just over here is silence 2 miles down. As the story breathes, the chill vibe stays on purpose. No jump scares, no haunted music. This corridor's real mood is late-night radio. A calm voice, warm water sounds, practical minds, and respect for a hard workplace. People who cross this water for a living, pilots, deckhands, mates, captains, talk like that. They are not thrill seekers by nature. They are risk managers with a good sense of humor. They carry stories of close shaves and tired landings. They also carry routines that work so often they fade into the background. This program's job is to bring those routines forward for a while, then let them fade again as the sea takes its usual place as a steady friend and occasional teacher. If the documentary played in a museum gallery at night, the next wall would show a long lit line of dates from 1918 to today, with small captions and icons, an anchor for ships, a prop for planes. The early decades would have fewer icons, not because the sea was safer, but because reporting was thinner. The post-war decades would grow crowded. Traffic and media both boomed. The modern decades would show fewer unexplained tags and more recovered quickly notes. The tech leap changed the curve. On a side panel, a simple graphic would explain radar horizons in one clean sketch, and a second graphic would show the stream as a blue ribbon pushing north, with tiny arrows for wind crossing it. That's the entire trick of the corridor in 2 pictures, what the tools can't see, and how the water moves. There's room for one last deep breath on human perception. The brain does not love uncertainty. When it hears no trace, it wants a cause that either reassures or thrills. The humble cause, fatigue under a rainy sky, a misread needle, a wave that stacked funny, feels too small to carry a big headline. But small causes, in the right sequence, make big outcomes. That is how aviation and maritime safety actually work. Layer small protections to block small errors and break the chain. Most days, the layers hold. On a few days, the chain completes itself. Those are the days this corridor lends to writers. The duty here is not to scold the stories, but to size them correctly. The circle closes where it began. 5 Avengers in hazy air. A steel giant loaded deep. Liners in cloud. A yacht near city lights. They live in memory, not because a map is magic, but because the people inside those stories left questions no one could answer. Modern tools answer many similar questions now, fast and well. The practical meaning of that is simple. People learning to sail or to fly in this corridor today inherit more safety, more information, and better rescue, as long as they respect weather, plan their fuel, mind their drift, and talk to someone when the sky looks wrong. A quiet line lingers for those listening in bed. Out past the last buoy, the water slides north steady and warm. Instruments glow, engines hum, and experienced hands move with no wasted motion. That's the truth beneath the myth. Patience, skill, and a lot of nights where nothing happens at all, because people did ordinary things at the right time. The ocean is indifferent. That's not cold, it's consistent. Consistency is exactly what good crews rely on when everything else gets weird. In the quiet hours that follow the big headlines, the corridor yields smaller files that teach by detail. A radio log from a cutter notes the way rain static built toward midnight and erased voices that minutes earlier were clear. A lighthouse keeper's journal from an outer key records a line of angry cloud rolling over the reef, and then a sudden calm as the wind shifted by several points. A mechanic's notebook from a charter company lists a string of spark plug changes on an engine that ran lean in humid air. None of these items are dramatic. Together, they are a map of how ordinary variables lean on crews and machines until the timing lines up just wrong. A straightforward case, often cited by old hands, involves a twin-engine transport from the piston era flying a milk run leg over dark water. The crew reported routine waypoints, then adjusted altitude to dodge light icing. Fuel math looked fine on paper, but the wind at the new level ran a knotty crossflow, and drift grew. The next scheduled report never came. Decades later, veterans reading the file see a familiar picture. A night descent toward what the crew expected was land. A layer of low cloud that kept the horizon hidden. A tired radio operator saving battery by transmitting less often. And a simple misinterpretation of a bearing that felt right at the time. The absence of mid-ocean radar meant nobody ashore watched that small error grow. It's not romantic. It is, however, very human. A practical interlude clarifies why no Mayday recurs in so many narratives. Emergency calls rely on 3 things happening at once. Someone recognizing the emergency, someone having the bandwidth to speak, and the equipment being healthy enough to transmit and receive. In a ditching at night,
The hands needed to set up a call are also needed to trim, level, and flare. In a sudden capsize, the person next to the radio may be underwater in seconds. Lightning and static, common companions to squalls, can blot out a weak voice entirely. Procedural gaps matter too. In earlier eras, the expectation that routine position reports would suffice meant that crews did not habitually broadcast their exact coordinates as often as modern tracking now shares them automatically. The silence that follows is less a riddle than a reflection of how fast real emergencies compress time. Quick fact: the Gulf Stream's surface can sprint faster than a jogger. That speed matters for everything from life rafts to seat cushions. A raft that deploys just off Miami and survives a squall can travel north a surprising distance by morning. Debris released 10 miles offshore might be 60 miles up the coast within a day under the right combinations of wind and current. Search planning treats that river of water like a moving conveyor belt. Patterns are shifted upstream and downstream to account for likely set and drift. A careful planner computes leeway. The downwind component an object adds to simple current drift. Using object-specific tables, a high-floating cooler blows faster than a low-floating hatch cover. This is the backstage math that makes search operations methodical rather than hopeful. Watch out for this. In storytelling, no trace often means no trace found within the original practical search window given fuel, weather, and daylight. It does not mean no trace forever. Offshore fishermen pull up fragments years later that no longer have identifying marks. Beachcombers find life rings without names faded to a blank. Modern beach patrols will sometimes find tagged debris from cases believed long closed. But the tag's trail leads to a family that has moved, a company that merged, or a registry that changed hands. Without a crisp chain of custody, what could have closed a loop remains just another piece of the ocean's lost and found. The Wild Ideas section benefits from generous attention to evidence thresholds because it helps the mind relax. Methane hydrate releases would leave chemical clues, bubble field signatures, and likely be reported by multiple independent vessels in the same hour if they were large enough to sink a ship. Those multi-source same-hour reports don't populate the logs. Localized magnetic anomalies, large enough to swing a compass dramatically, would be charted by survey ships and satellites. Mariners routinely consult variation charts that would flag such zones, and yet no notices to mariners warn of an unstable magnetic pit where the legend places it. Space-time claims would require synchronized instruments to disagree in a durable way. Clocks verified before and after, independent of each other, showing the same deviation. The case files don't show that either. What they do show are vivid atmospherics, sudden rain curtains, the optical confusion of dark squalls against dark seas, the deceptive stillness of weed mats. Those are real, repeatable, and adequately mysterious without leaving physics. Reconstruction gained power in the last 2 generations. To rebuild the likely path of a lost vessel or aircraft, investigators pull archived winds, seas, and pressures from global reanalysis datasets, then marry them with performance curves for the machine. For Flight 19, for example, a realistic west wind component combined with a belief about location produces candidate courses that paradoxically steer farther away from land while feeling like they aim for it. Those courses intersect with fuel endurance lines at positions that fall outside the early search boxes, mostly because searchers had to start near something they could reach quickly that first night. As for Cyclops, modern stress models applied to hulls of similar length and framing, carrying dense cargo, predict hotspots where structural failure is more plausible. That kind of lab work never produces a headline, but it tightens probabilities so families can hold a picture with fewer shadows. Human factors can be rendered in simple, non-jargon words and still be precise. Fatigue is not just sleepiness, it is a measurable reduction in working memory. Task saturation is not drama, it is a cue that exceeds the brain's short-term buffer, forcing it to drop items. Confirmation bias is not stubbornness, it is the brain's default to favor the first explanation that felt coherent. Crew resource management is not a corporate phrase, It is a culture that makes it normal for a junior member to ask a senior member to check a heading, or for a captain to say again, when the answer arrived too quickly. In files from this corridor, where the weather changes fast and the sensory field is confusing at night, those human factors appear again and again. The remedies are simple. Write decisions down, pre-brief turn-back points, assign one voice to the radio and one to the map, and build pauses where the team deliberately restates where we are and how we know. The Sagasso's role deserves one more angle, how it alters search visibility. Weed mats create texture that sucks up contrast. From a helicopter, orange is the favorite color for a reason. Eyes and sensors love it. But an orange cushion half sunk among gold-brown weed flecks under a low sun is far less obvious than V'gers expect. Thermal cameras help at night when a human body's warmth contrasts with water, but a recent squall can drop sea surface temperature and blur that contrast. In high humidity, sensor range shortens. All of this explains why perfectly executed searches still miss small targets sometimes. It also explains why the advice for modern small craft crews focuses so much on high visibility gear and lights that continue flashing if a device flips. Legal and insurance frameworks may sound like paperwork, but they shape the official words used in many famous write-ups. Under SOLAS and later safety regimes, operators document equipment checks and crew training in ways that earlier eras did not. When a file says unexplained, it often means the investigators cannot point to a single documented failure in that paperwork, and no wreck was recovered to confirm a mechanical cause. In other words, it is a placeholder for evidence insufficient, not a code for we suspect sorcery. Accident boards reopen cases only when new physical evidence appears, an identifiable section of hull is found, or a recorder surfaces with recoverable data, or a credible time-stamped photograph emerges that contradicts the established timeline. This threshold prevents the system from chasing echoes and keeps resources ready for incidents where the new clue can actually move the needle. Culture keeps building the aura because the ingredients are evergreen. A familiar map, a short list of emblematic cases, and a promise that there is something just out of frame. Films take the viewer over blue plains under slow strings. Paperbacks lean on elliptical transitions, and then nothing. Tourism portals put triangle icons on brochures beside dolphins and parasails. None of this needs to be scolded. It is the sign that the sea still plays the role it has always played in imagination, vast, beautiful, and just beyond everyday reach. The better move is to enjoy the mood while remembering that the crews at the heart of the stories were professionals, having professional days that went sideways for reasons their tools and training couldn't quite cover in time. Return once more to the two anchor cases. Not as ghosts but as teachers. The training flight holds up a mirror for any team operating under changing conditions. Write down assumptions, remeasure wind, cross-check heading, keep the group together until a verified fix is in hand, and if dispersion becomes unavoidable, assign altitudes or headings to maximize mutual rescue chances later. The rescue seaplane's loss underscores the parallel truth that emergencies sometimes multiply not because of a place's curse, but because urgency puts challenging machines into challenging air. The Colossus that never radioed again cautions that load, structure, and weather form a triangle of their own. When any two are unfavorable, the third must be managed with extra care. Data normalization yields one last clean picture for the night. Consider the corridor's incident rate per million vessel miles in mid-century versus late century versus the present. As tracking improved and safety culture matured, the rate fell, even as raw numbers of crossings rose. Compare that to other windy jugulars of global travel. The South China Sea, the approaches to the North Sea, the Tasman, and the numbers rhyme. The Bermuda brand made this corridor famous, not a supernormal hazard profile. The few truly open cases glow brighter against a safer backdrop. That glow is a trick of contrast. Contemporary testimonies keep the tone grounded. A Coast Guard boatswain describes a night alongside a disabled sportfisher when a microburst marched through like a wall. It felt like somebody dropped a room on the boat. The anemometer spiked, the water turned white and loud, and for 1 minute everything was noise. Then it passed. An airline dispatcher recalls a long-range turboprop flight that requested a climb due to chop, only to find the winds worse and the fuel plan suddenly tight. The captain called early, diverted, and landed with heavy rain beating the ramp. The lesson they repeat afterward is the same one that threads through this entire broadcast. Margin is not a luxury, it's a discipline. For those who like simple, take-home advice, distilled from a century of files. The list is short and friendly. Plan conservatively. Track position more often than ego says is necessary. Treat the Gulf Stream as a moving road that never stops. Respect any sky that builds towers or curtains faster than a kettle boils. Close and latch before the first spray. Keep a backup for any instrument that has ever failed a human before. Spike up on the radio when the picture gets fuzzy. A routine call heard by another boat or a distant controller has rescued more crews than any single gadget. These habits do not turn the ocean into a playground. They turn it into what it already is for professionals. A demanding workplace that rewards calm repetition. The mind may still ask, after all these patient pages, what remains that radar cannot explain? The honest list is small and stubborn. A few cases lack a solid, last fix, and occurred at night, in weather that left few eyes on scene, making any reverse engineering speculative. A few involve machines whose maintenance histories were not documented in a way that survives, leaving gaps that no amount of modeling can fill. A few happened near deep water, where even a modern well-funded expedition has not yet spent the time to locate the hull. Those sit in the open bin not because a doorway to somewhere else opened, but because time and depth are expensive. It is fair to say they remain mysteries. It is also fair to say their mystery is ordinary. The master timeline, if spoken aloud, sounds like a roll call that grows more precise as it approaches the present. The voice would touch 1918 and a long steel hull riding low. The mid-1940s and a formation of Avengers fading into rain. The late 1940s with prop liners reporting points across big water. The early 1960s with a chemical cargo in a converted tank hull. The small boats whose names never reached beyond local docks. Each decade after the 1970s would note the rise of satellites, the decline of untracked flights, and the growth of quick, successful rescues. The last 2 decades would emphasize how often beacons speak for crews now and how often that voice turns an incident into an inconvenience, instead of a tragedy. Attribution in a calm voice belongs here, because it keeps the tone respectful. The files that inform this narrative live in logbooks, weather archives, Coast Guard circulars, Navy summaries, accident board reports, and the work of careful historians and investigators who tested popular stories against primary sources. They wrote in dry prose so that later readers could stand on something solid. Tonight's broadcast borrows their steadiness. The sign-off returns to the water as it is right now, warm on top, swift where the stream runs, glassy under the stars when the wind takes a breath. Bridges glow. Cockpits keep a soft nightlight far offshore beyond where beach lights can touch. A ship's wake writes a straight white line that fades behind like chalk dust in a dark room. That is the enduring image worth keeping. The Bermuda Triangle is not a trap laid by the sea. It is a mirror held up to human travel, showing tools improving, habits hardening into safety, and a handful of stories that linger because something simple failed in a complicated moment. Curiosity is welcome here. So is respect. Sleep comes easier. With that in mind, the sea will still be there in the morning, wide and indifferent, ready for the next safe crossing by people who plan well. Watch the sky and keep talking when the night gets loud.